Before we get started, I wanted to mention that I very recently gave in and opened a Facebook account. So if you want to see art posts and tips from me more often, please follow me on Facebook. I checked out the Cartoon Museum in San Francisco recently, and this included a cool piece by Eric Larson and Alex Ross, where Eric Larson had done the pencils and Alex Ross had done the gouache painting over the top. And if you know anything about me, you know I love Alex Ross, which is why I've reviewed his books in the past. And I've also done a Batman gouache demo where the reference was a piece where Bruce Timm did the pencils and Alex Ross did the gouache. The Cartoon Museum also had some pieces by Todd McFarlane, and I really love Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. So today I'm going to do a Todd McFarlane style Spider-Man. I took an illustration by Todd McFarlane. I'm going to use it as a teaching reference. I did change the composition so it's facing from left to right, and also I'm going to do a different abstract background. I did the gestural pose first, where I just threw in some quick gestural lines and the main shapes. After that, I worked out all the details with a lot of pencil and a lot of erasing. Draw the main lines first when you do the webbing. The best way to make everything look fluid in a complicated illustration is to do all the gestural lines for everything first, whether it's the figure or the webbing, and then come back and do the details afterward. Now this painting is going to be done entirely in ink. I'm going to do most of the ink with brush work, but I'm going to start out doing the webbing with a Zig marker, which is light, fast, and archival, and also it doesn't bleed when you put water over the top, and this is important because in this case I do not want the ink to bleed. So I'm going to start doing the webbing now, and I'm going to do just the very beginning part in real time before I speed up, so you can see that, you know, I'm taking my time and being careful about laying down these strokes, and you want to do the sort of funnel, ropey part of the webbing first, and then you can go back and try to figure out whether your little squiggly part is going in front of or behind that main rope part of it, and just keep going like that and relax and calm down. Anybody can do this, and it's a lot of fun if you just take your time. After I'm done with the webbing, I'm going to switch to using Dr. Phil Martin's India inks, which are permanent. I'm going to dilute them a bit with water because once these dry, they sort of form a hard film in your glass and everything, and if it dries faster than your painting, then you lose some ink. So you can dilute it with some water if you're going to be working slower. And I'm going to be using a 20/0 round brush, and also I'm going to attempt to use a size 00 Da Vinci Maestro brush. Also, I tried using the incredible nib, which I think is very ironically named because it's not incredible at all. It's even brand new. Its nib is so broad that you can't really use it for any kind of fine effects. Maybe I can use it to like clean grout or something, because I don't think anybody should use this for their artwork. You can see I started doing some of the ink work with the size 00 sable brush, and I'm not liking it, so I'm going to switch pretty quickly to the 20/0 teeny tiny brush, and it's basically just a spotter more or less, and you can use it for really thin lines, even thinner than you would get if you were using a marker. Also, you'll notice I have my dinky little half mittens on again, and this is because there's so much pencil involved with this illustration that I just have to wear that, otherwise I'm going to smear the graphite right into the paper. Also, you might not want to dilute the ink more than 50%, which is for every 1 drop of ink, use 1 drop of water, because the more you dilute your ink, the more likely you're going to end up with the ink not laying down as well. It's going to sort of bead up instead of laying down in a more silky way. Also, if you water down your ink too much, you're going to have to do numerous washes of black because you're going to turn it into a gray, and so that's another thing to keep in mind. Is I'm just going to keep laying in all of these fine lines, and you can see that you can get extremely thin little lines with your brush, and that's one of the reasons I like it. And also the brush has more character than using most markers, where most markers will actually give you a really uniform line the entire time. What happens with a brush is you can make it a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner, and you can push it in different directions, and it gives you this really sort of amazing line with personality, so it's less boring than if you just used a marker. And the trick to good inking also is to have a sort of rock solid pencil drawing underneath it. So spend a lot of time on your pencil. You'll be a lot less nervous about where your lines go, and you'll be more confident, and that'll show in your strokes. Well, I will say that if I start to get exhausted doing something that's more detailed, then my way of making sure that it doesn't get too exhausting and stays fun is to go to an easier part of the illustration and ink that, so I'm not constantly inking an area where it's complicated. Just have faith in yourself and go slowly and be relaxed. You can turn on an audiobook or some music while you're doing this. Once your ink is all done and your pencil lines have all been erased, then you're ready to start painting. So I'm going to pull out my plexiglass palette, and I'm going to drop a few drops of red, bright red, yellow, and blue onto it. And then I'm going to dilute them with water, but just another drop each on top. And you don't have to put all the ink that you'll need onto the paper at once. Remember what I said, it dries in the skin and becomes useless because it's not like watercolor, it won't reconstitute. So just put out a little bit at a time, it goes a long way, and then when you run out, get some more. I'm going to start with the red. The one red by itself just looked a little bit too cold, so I add a little bit of the orange red into it to warm it up a bit, because I think that's more of what Spidey's color is. Ink actually goes down really flat, typically, so it doesn't really dry with very many different variations. So it's like doing an old-fashioned comic book or coloring book painting illustration. You have a sort of flat body wash of a particular color, and it's very easily achieved with ink. So if you ever want to do that and you can't do it with watercolor, then know that that's a lot easier to do with ink. I actually grew up doing mostly comic book illustrations. It gave me a lot of practice for my drafting skills because comic books have such great proportions and illustrations. I'm going back over with a darker red, and again, it's very easy. It's like doing a coloring page. There isn't any blending, hard edges everywhere. So the blue I already have in my palette, I'm going to add a smidge of that into my red color, and that'll give me this darker red to go over as a shadow color. I would suggest doing that instead of using black, because black will dull it, make it grayer, and if you use any other color, it won't be harmonious with the other colors, so you want to have a limited palette. So I sort of have the two reds, the blue, and the yellow. I don't want to pull out any more colors. Now that I'm done painting with my red, I want to show you what's happened to the red on my palette. You can see that the portion that's not used has dried in a hard skin. It's like a little thin acrylic film of some sort, and it won't come up. I'm gonna have to use a little bit of rubbing alcohol and a paper towel later to get this off, but again, it's not like watercolor, it's permanent, and I found that it's easier to get off of a piece of flat plexiglass than my ceramic palette. And now I'm gonna go ahead and do the blue. The black ink that I did earlier actually stands in for the shadow in the blue in McFarlane's illustration. So in this case, all I have to do is put in the parts where there's no shadow in as blue, and it'll make that entire area read as blue with dark black shadow. Now the great thing again about McFarlane's Spider-Man, his Spider-Man was very sort of contorted. That's why he's got these great sort of crazy poses that are super flexible. He's got a lot of scribbly lines, a lot of crazy webbing, and so it's this creepy, cool, really sort of detailed look. It's not like doing a Spider-Man that somebody like John Romita or Jack Kirby would have drawn, and they're very beautiful in their own way. But one of the things that you get with Todd McFarlane is you might think he's actually harder to start with. It's actually he's easier to start with than, say, if you were doing a Jack Kirby or a John Romita Sr. style Spider-Man. And that's because those guys hardly had any extra lines. All that scribbliness, it actually hides mistakes and it's more forgiving. If you want to have a more forgiving drawing and ink illustration, then you really want to have a lot of scribbles and a lot of lines and a lot of busyness. I'm going to move on to the webbing, and I sort of like the redder purple better, but I still think it's a little bit too bright, so I'm going to gray it down actually with some white paint, not to opacify it too much, but basically to make it cloudy and more sort of like sticky, webby looking. So it's a great way to assess the weight of a particular piece of webbing. So if you like it heavier, then color in the whole piece, including a background gap. And if you want it to look lighter, then leave the little background gap showing. You can have some artistic license. Even though you're using a reference, in this case an illustration, you don't have to copy everything. You can add as many original touches as you want. And this goes for whether you're using an illustration or looking at something in real life or looking at a photo. Do what you can to make it your own. You'll do this subconsciously by how you choose colors, how you choose shading, where you put your lines, but you can even do it more consciously by changing things deliberately and making them more of your own. I'm getting ready to do the background, and recall at some point that I did a 77 techniques and effects of watercolor and gouache, which I hope you watch because it has a great number of techniques that you could use. But one of the techniques I did was cheesecloth that creates this great texture, and I'm going to do that for this video. And the reason I'm using it for this video in particular for the background is because I think it makes this awesome, well, cheesecloth looks like spider webs sort of when you spread it out, so I think that texture is perfect for a Spider-Man background. It's like it was made for him. I'm choosing green and yellow for my background because those colors aren't used in Spider-Man, so in order to make him stand out more from the background, I'm going to use colors that are different, and green does happen to be the complement of red, and I'm mixing this green out of the blue that we have and a yellow, the primary yellow that I had on my palette. So again, it looks a little bit more harmonious. The other reason I'm using yellow and green is because yellow and green are sort of associated with like nuclear or toxic radioactive fluids and everything, and because Spider-Man was bit by a radioactive spider, it makes a perfect background color for him. You can put the cheesecloth down on the paper first, or you can put it down later after you put some ink down. I choose to put it down first. So I'm going to put it down first. I'm going to add ink over the top, and you want to really saturate the paper. The paper has to be totally saturated, covered where you want the ink to be in the final piece, because if you leave any gaps, it will be there in the final piece. And also you want to make sure the cheesecloth is saturated. If the cheesecloth is dry, you're not going to get any kind of effect. You're going to have to use a lot more ink or a lot more watercolor if that's what you're using in order to create this effect. So be aware that you are going to end up using a lot more paint than you would normally if you weren't using something that was soaking up a lot of your ink. Once you're done putting all your cheesecloth down and saturating it with different colors of yellow and green, which is what I did, then when it's completely dry, take the cheesecloth off. And because this is ink, it's going to be harder to take the cheesecloth fibers off. It's a formula created by Dr. Phil Martins, and it has a little bit of acrylic something in it. So when you take this cheesecloth off, it actually tears some of the paper up. If you like that kind of speckled effect where the paper is coming up, it works perfectly for this piece. You can use it for your ink pieces. But if it doesn't work, if it's something very serene and has to be perfect, then do not use ink. Use watercolor. So keep in mind whether or not you want that effect when you're using the ink, because that's what's going to happen when you use this ink. So you can see I started with a gestural sketch, which had very large shapes and was very flowing, so I can capture the pose. Then I went back and added in details with my pencil and erased as much as I wanted. After you're done inking everything, before you start painting, use an eraser to erase all the pencil lines. We went ahead and painted it with ink in Spider-Man's colors and did the background in this cool cheesecloth textural effect. And again, it did pull up some of the paper in these white areas, and to me it makes it look even more sort of cool and energetic. But if you do not want that effect, then don't use ink, use watercolor. So this was a very late Inktober submission, but I hope you enjoy the demo anyway. So I hope you're excited enough to do an ink piece of your own, especially with some cool cheesecloth textural effects. Check out my other videos, and I'll see you again soon.